January 17, 1991, 2:38 in the morning. The desert sky over southern Iraq is dark and moonless. The only sound is the wind moving across the sand. Suddenly, 8 American helicopters appear, flying in 2 formations, just 50 feet above the ground, moving at 120 miles per hour through the darkness. They are AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, the most advanced helicopter gunships in the world. Inside each cockpit, 2 pilots wearing night vision goggles see the landscape in shades of green. They are navigating using GPS, a technology so new that most people have never heard of it. They are heading toward 2 Iraqi early warning radar sites deep inside Iraqi territory. These radar sites are the eyes of Iraq's air defense network. They watch the skies, looking for incoming aircraft, providing warning so that Iraqi fighters can scramble and air defenses can activate. Destroy these radar sites, and you create a blind spot, a corridor through which hundreds of coalition aircraft can fly undetected into the heart of Iraq. This is the mission of these 8 Apache. They will fire the first shots of Operation Desert Storm. They will open the war. In the next 10 minutes, these helicopters will destroy both radar installations with such precision and such devastating firepower that the Iraqi crews never have a chance to send a warning. This is the story of how American Apache helicopters started the Gulf War, how a handful of pilots flying a revolutionary weapons system executed one of the most critical and perfectly executed missions in military history, a mission that had to succeed because if it failed, the entire air campaign, the entire war, would be jeopardized. To understand why this mission was so important, you need to understand the plan for Operation Desert Storm. The coalition strategy was to begin with a massive air campaign that would destroy Iraq's military capability before ground forces ever crossed into Kuwait or Iraq. The air campaign was meticulously planned, with targets selected months in advance. Iraqi air defenses, command and control centers, military installations, infrastructure, all had been identified and assigned to specific aircraft. The first wave of attacks would hit the most critical targets, the ones that had to be destroyed immediately. These included Iraqi radar sites, surface-to-air missile batteries, communications centers, and command bunkers. The goal was to blind and deafen the Iraqi military in the first hours of the war, to prevent them from coordinating a defense. But there was a problem. The Iraqi air defense network was extensive and sophisticated. Iraq had spent billions of dollars on Soviet-made radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-aircraft guns. The network was integrated, with radar sites feeding information to command centers, which directed fighters and missiles. If coalition aircraft flew into Iraq, the radar sites would detect them. Iraqi command would know the attack was coming. They could scramble fighters, activate SAM sites, warn their forces. The element of surprise would be lost. The first wave of coalition aircraft would face fully alerted defenses. Losses would be higher. Some critical targets might not be destroyed if the Iraqis had time to respond. The solution was to create gaps in the radar coverage, corridors through which coalition aircraft could fly without being detected until they were already over their targets. But how do you create these gaps? You cannot jam every radar in Iraq simultaneously. You cannot destroy every radar site with missiles, because the Iraqis would detect the missiles coming and would know the war had started. What you need is a surgical strike that destroys specific radar sites at a specific moment. Just minutes before the main air armada arrives, giving the Iraqis no time to react or to warn their forces. This required a special kind of platform, one that could fly low to avoid detection, navigate precisely in darkness to find targets in the middle of the desert, hover and engage targets with precision weapons, and do all of this without making mistakes, because there would be no second chance. The platform chosen was the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. The Apache was relatively new in 1991, having entered service in 1986. It was designed from the ground up as a tank killer, a helicopter that could destroy Soviet armored columns in a European war. It was armed with Hellfire missiles, 17 rockets, and a 13 chain gun. It was armored to withstand ground fire. It was equipped with advanced sensors, including infrared targeting systems and night vision. Most importantly for this mission, it had a target acquisition and designation system, or TADS, that combined infrared sensors with laser designators, allowing the crew to find and engage targets at night with precision. The Apache could fly low, using terrain to mask its approach. It could navigate using GPS and inertial navigation systems. It could hover behind cover, pop up, engage targets, and disappear again. It was the perfect tool for the mission. But using Apache for this mission was not without risk. Helicopters are vulnerable. They are slower than jets. They fly low where they can be hit by small arms fire. If something went wrong, if the Apache were detected before they reached the targets, they would be easy prey for Iraqi fighters or missiles. The crews would have no support. They would be deep inside enemy territory, beyond the range of friendly air defenses or rescue forces. If they were shot down, capture or death were the only outcomes. The mission required not just technical skill, but extraordinary courage. The planning for this mission was exhaustive. It fell to the 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. The battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody, a highly experienced aviator who would later become Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Cody and his team studied the problem for weeks. They identified 2 key radar sites that needed to be destroyed. These sites, designated Objectives Nevada and Oklahoma by the planners, were early warning radar installations located in western Iraq near the Saudi border. They were spaced about 30 miles apart. Each site had multiple radars, command buildings, generators, and support facilities. Each was defended by anti-aircraft weapons and manned by dozens of Iraqi soldiers. Destroying these sites would create a 20-mile wide gap in Iraqi radar coverage, a corridor through which coalition aircraft could fly undetected on their way to targets in Baghdad and elsewhere. The mission profile was complex. 8 Apache would launch from a forward operating base near the Iraqi border. They would fly at extremely low altitude, 50 feet or less, to avoid radar detection. They would use night vision and GPS to navigate in total darkness across featureless desert. They would split into 2 teams of 4. One team, called Sign Red Team, would attack Objective Nevada. The other team, called Sign White Team, would attack Objective Oklahoma. The 2 attacks had to happen simultaneously. If one team destroyed their target before the other, the second site might receive a warning and could alert the Iraqi air defense network. Timing was everything. The attacks would begin at exactly 2:38 a.m. local time. Both targets had to be destroyed within minutes. Then the Apache would return to base, and moments later, the first wave of coalition aircraft, over 100 jets, would fly through the corridor the Apache had opened. The training for the mission was intense. The Apache crews rehearsed the attack profile repeatedly. They practiced flying at night at extremely low altitude. They practiced navigating to precise coordinates using GPS, a skill that required trust in technology that was still new and unfamiliar to many pilots. They practiced engaging multiple targets quickly and accurately. They rehearsed communication procedures, ensuring that the two teams could coordinate their attacks without breaking radio silence until the last possible moment. They studied reconnaissance photos of the target sites, memorizing the layout, identifying priority targets. They planned their approach routes, their firing positions, their escape routes. Every detail was considered and rehearsed. The Apache helicopters were prepared meticulously. Each bird was loaded with a full complement of weapons: Hellfire missiles, laser-guided anti-tank missiles that could destroy hardened structures with precision, 17 rockets, unguided but deadly against soft targets and personnel, the 13 chain gun with hundreds of rounds of high-explosive ammunition. The helicopters were checked and rechecked. Engines, rotors, weapons systems, navigation systems, radios, night vision equipment, all had to be perfect. There would be no maintenance crew waiting at the target if something broke. Every system had to work flawlessly for hours in a hostile environment. The crews were hand-picked. These were not novices. These were experienced Army aviators, men who had flown helicopters for years, who had thousands of hours in the cockpit. The pilot in command of each Apache was typically a warrant officer, a highly trained technical expert. The co-pilot gunner, who operated the weapons and targeting systems, was also an experienced aviator. These crews had trained together, had developed the kind of teamwork and communication that comes only with time and practice. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They trusted each other with their lives. On the night of January 16, 1991, the crews assembled for their final briefing. The tension was palpable. They knew this was it. The mission they had trained for was now real. They reviewed the plan one last time. Weather good, intelligence, no change in enemy dispositions. Fuel, weapons, equipment all ready. The mission was go. The crews suited up in flight gear, survival vests packed with everything they might need if they went down, radios, flares, pistols, water, first aid supplies. They conducted their pre-flight checks, walking around their helicopters, visually inspecting everything, checking that weapons were properly mounted, that panels were secure, that nothing was leaking or loose. At the designated time, the 8 Apache lifted off into the night. The noise of the rotors was loud, but once they were airborne and moving away from the base, the sound faded into the darkness. The helicopters formed up into their two teams and began the flight north into Iraq. Flying at 50 feet above the ground at night is an exercise in controlled terror. The pilots wore night vision goggles that amplified ambient light, turning the dark landscape into a green-tinted image. But depth perception is limited with night vision. Obstacles, power lines, terrain features all can appear suddenly. The pilots had to trust their instruments, their GPS navigation, their altimeters. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the helicopter could hit the ground at 120 miles per hour. There would be no survivors. The flight to the targets took about 30 minutes. The Apache maintained radio silence. They flew in formation, following GPS waypoints, staying low, watching for any sign that they had been detected. The crews scanned the horizon through their night vision systems, looking for Iraqi patrols, vehicles, anything that might spot them. The desert was dark and empty. The Iraqis had no idea what was coming. As the Apache approached their targets, the teams separated. Red team headed toward Objective Nevada. White team headed toward Objective Oklahoma. The crews could see the targets now on their infrared displays. The radar installations glowed with heat signatures. The radars were operating, spinning, scanning the skies to the south, watching for the attack they knew was coming but had not yet detected. Buildings, vehicles, generators all showed up as warm spots against the cool desert background. The targets were exactly where intelligence had said they would be. The plan was for each team to establish firing positions about 5 kilometers from their target, far enough to be outside the range of small arms fire, but close enough for accurate Hellfire shots. The Apache would hover behind low ridges or terrain features, using the ground to mask their position. Then, on command, they would pop up, acquire targets with their laser designators, fire their weapons, and immediately drop back down to cover. This technique, called nap of the earth flying, was standard Apache tactics. It minimized exposure to enemy fire. At exactly 2:38 a.m., the time synchronized to the second, the attack began. The Apache of both teams rose from their concealed positions, their targeting systems locking onto the Iraqi installations. The crews worked with practiced efficiency. The pilot held the helicopter steady in a hover. The co-pilot gunner operated the TADS, slewing the infrared camera and laser designator to each target in turn. The first targets were the radar dishes themselves, the critical components of the installations. A radar destroyed is a radar that cannot warn anyone. The co-pilot gunner placed the aiming reticle on a radar dish, locked the laser designator on it, and fired a Hellfire missile. The missile launched from its rail under the Apache's stub wing with a flash and a roar. The laser-guided Hellfire flew toward the target, homing in on the reflected laser light. 3 seconds later, the missile impacted the radar dish. The explosion was spectacular, destroying the radar and sending shrapnel in all directions. The gunner was already acquiring the next target, another radar, a command building, a generator. Hellfire after Hellfire launched. Each found its mark. The precision was extraordinary. Targets were being destroyed exactly as planned. The Iraqi defenders were caught completely by surprise. The first they knew of the attack was when explosions started tearing their installation apart. They had no warning. The Apache were too far away to be heard over the noise of the generators and equipment. The missiles came out of the darkness without warning. Iraqi soldiers ran from buildings, some trying to reach their anti-aircraft guns, others just trying to escape the explosions. The Apache switched to their 17 rockets and 13 guns, raking the area with fire. The rockets exploded across the compound, destroying vehicles and buildings. The 13 chain gun fired in long bursts, the high-explosive shells ripping through structures and equipment. The Iraqi defenders had no chance to fight back. Within minutes, both Objective Nevada and Objective Oklahoma were burning ruins. The attack was so swift and so devastating that the Iraqi crews at the radar sites never sent a warning. They never had time. The first explosions cut power and destroyed communications equipment. Within seconds, the radars themselves were destroyed. Even if someone had wanted to warn Iraqi command, there was no way to do it. The telephone lines were cut. The radios were destroyed. The radar sites were isolated and burning. The mission was a complete success. The Apache did not linger. Once their targets were confirmed destroyed, they broke off and headed south back towards Saudi Arabia. The return flight was flown at the same low altitude, the same high speed. The crews were exhilarated and exhausted. They had done it. They had executed the mission perfectly. Both targets destroyed, no friendly aircraft lost, no casualties. It was a textbook operation. Behind them, the Iraqi radar sites burned, sending pillars of black smoke into the night sky. As the Apache crossed back into Saudi airspace, the first wave of coalition aircraft was already approaching the corridor the Apache had opened. F-15C Eagles, F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters, F-111 bombers, Navy F-18 Hornets, British Tornadoes, all flying north toward their targets in Iraq. They flew through the gap in the radar coverage without being detected. The Iraqi Air Defense Network did not know they were coming until bombs started falling on Baghdad and other targets. The surprise was total. The coalition achieved air superiority in the first hours of the war, in large part because 8 Apache helicopters had destroyed 2 radar sites in the opening minutes of the conflict. The success of this mission had implications far beyond the immediate tactical results. It demonstrated the capabilities of the Apache helicopter in a combat environment. It proved that precision night attacks using GPS navigation and laser-guided weapons were feasible. It showed that helicopters could operate deep inside enemy territory and execute complex missions successfully. These lessons influenced military doctrine for decades. The Apache became the model for attack helicopter design worldwide. The tactics developed for this mission were refined and taught to subsequent generations of Army aviators. The technology used in this mission represented the cutting edge of military capability in 1991. The GPS navigation system, which is now ubiquitous, was relatively new. The satellites were in place and the system was operational, but many military units were still learning to trust it. The Apache crews on this mission relied entirely on GPS to navigate to their targets in darkness across featureless desert. The fact that they reached their targets precisely at exactly the right time demonstrated the revolutionary potential of satellite navigation. This mission helped convince the military establishment that GPS was reliable and should be integrated into all future systems. The laser-guided Hellfire missile was another piece of advanced technology that proved itself in this mission. The Hellfire had been developed during the Cold War as an anti-tank weapon designed to destroy Soviet armor. In this mission, it was used against stationary targets, buildings, and radar installations. The results were excellent. Every Hellfire fired hit its target. The precision was far better than unguided rockets or bombs could achieve. This demonstrated that precision weapons were not just useful, they were essential for missions requiring surgical strikes. The military's investment in precision-guided munitions was validated. The night vision and infrared systems on the Apache were critical to the mission's success. The crews could see in total darkness, could identify targets, could navigate, could fight. The Iraqis without equivalent technology were blind. They could not see the helicopters. They could not see the missiles coming. They could not effectively fight back. This disparity in night fighting capability became a theme of the Gulf War. The coalition owned the night. They could operate around the clock, while Iraqi forces were largely blind after dark. This 24-hour operational capability gave the coalition an enormous advantage. The training and skill of the Apache crews cannot be overstated. Flying helicopters is difficult. Flying them at night at 50 feet above the ground is extremely difficult. Doing so while navigating precisely, coordinating with other aircraft, finding targets, and engaging them accurately under combat conditions, this requires extraordinary skill. The Army's investment in training, in realistic exercises, in giving crews thousands of hours of flight time paid off. These crews were prepared. They had the skills needed to execute a mission with no margin for error. This professionalism was typical of American military forces in the Gulf War and was a major factor in the coalition's success. The psychological impact of this opening strike was significant. For the Iraqi military, the war began with confusion and disaster. Radar sites were being destroyed. Communications were disrupted. Air raid sirens were sounding in Baghdad as bombs fell. The Iraqi air defense network was in chaos. Iraqi commanders did not know what was happening or how to respond. This psychological shock, the overwhelming and sudden violence of the opening attack, set the tone for the entire war. Iraqi forces never recovered the initiative. They spent the rest of the war reacting to coalition moves, trying to survive rather than trying to win. For the coalition forces, the success of the opening strikes boosted morale and confidence. The plan had worked. The Iraqis were being hit hard, casualties were low. The technological superiority that planners had counted on was real and decisive. This confidence permeated the entire coalition military. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines all felt that they were part of a winning effort. This belief becomes self-fulfilling. Confident forces fight better, make better decisions, take appropriate risks. The psychological momentum created by the successful opening strikes carried through the entire campaign. The mission also demonstrated the value of joint operations, of different services and units working together toward a common goal. The Apache mission was an Army operation, but it was integrated into an overall air campaign planned and executed by the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. The timing had to be perfect. The Apache had to hit their targets at exactly the right moment so that the jets following behind would arrive during the window of radar blindness. This required coordination between Army aviation units and Air Force air operations centers. It required shared communications, shared intelligence, shared planning. The success of the mission showed that the American military had learned the lessons of jointness, that the services could work together effectively. The risks faced by the Apache crews are worth exploring in depth. If anything had gone wrong, if the helicopters had been detected before reaching their targets, the outcome could have been very different. Iraqi fighters could have been scrambled to intercept. Surface-to-air missiles could have been fired. The Apache would have been vulnerable. Helicopters cannot outrun fighters or missiles. The crews would have had to fight their way out, or more likely, would have been shot down. The thought of being captured by Iraqi forces was terrifying. Iraqi treatment of prisoners was brutal. American pilots captured early in the war were beaten and tortured. The Apache crews knew this risk. They flew the mission anyway because it was necessary. The physical challenges of the mission were also significant. Flying helicopters is physically demanding. The pilot is constantly making small control inputs to keep the aircraft stable and on course. The co-pilot gunner is operating complex weapons and sensor systems, cycling through targets, managing weapons releases. Both crew members are wearing night vision goggles, which are heavy and uncomfortable. They are wearing survival gear, body armor, helmets, all adding weight and restricting movement. The cockpit of an Apache is cramped. The flight to the target and back took hours. By the end of the mission, the crews were physically exhausted. The maintenance and support personnel who prepared the helicopters deserve recognition. Helicopters are mechanically complex and require constant maintenance. Engines, transmissions, rotor systems, weapons pylons, electronics all have to be inspected and maintained. The maintainers worked through the night before the mission, ensuring every helicopter was in perfect condition. They loaded the weapons, they fueled the aircraft, they ran tests on every system. Their work was essential. A helicopter that breaks down in enemy territory is useless. The maintainers made sure that did not happen. The intelligence personnel who identified the targets and planned the mission routes also played a critical role. They analyzed satellite imagery and signals intelligence to determine the locations of the radar sites. They studied the terrain to plan approach routes that would minimize the chances of detection. They provided the crews with detailed target folders showing the layout of the installations, identifying priority targets, warning of defensive positions. Good intelligence made the mission possible. The leadership decisions that led to this mission are worth analyzing. Choosing to use helicopters for this mission was bold. The conventional approach would have been to use cruise missiles or stealth aircraft, but helicopters offered advantages. They could loiter over the target, ensuring complete destruction. They could assess battle damage in real time. They could adapt if something unexpected happened. But helicopters were also riskier. The decision to use them reflected confidence in the technology, confidence in the crews, and a willingness to take calculated risks to achieve important objectives. The Iraqi perspective on this attack is harder to reconstruct because few Iraqi personnel from these sites survived or were willing to talk about the experience afterward. From what can be determined, the radar sites were on full alert, scanning for incoming aircraft, but they never detected the Apache. The helicopters flew too low and were too small to be picked up by the radars, which were designed to detect high-flying jets. The first indication of trouble was when the Hellfire missiles started impacting. Iraqi personnel described a sudden hell of explosions and fire. Some tried to fight back, manning anti-aircraft guns and firing blindly into the darkness. But they could not see the Apache, which was several kilometers away, hovering behind terrain. The return fire was ineffective. Within minutes, the sites were destroyed, and anyone who survived was running for their lives. The tactical innovations of this mission influenced subsequent operations. The concept of using attack helicopters to create gaps in air defenses was repeated in later operations. During the ground war, Apache conducted deep strikes against Iraqi ground forces, destroying artillery positions, command posts, and armor concentrations. The tactics were similar: fly low, use terrain for cover, engage with precision weapons from standoff range, escape before the enemy can react. These tactics proved highly effective throughout the war. The coordination between the Apache strikes and the following air campaign was a masterpiece of planning and execution. The timing window was tight. The Apache had to destroy the targets not too early, which would give the Iraqis time to send warnings through other channels, and not too late, which would mean the jets would arrive while the radars were still operating. The window was less than 10 minutes. The Apache hit their targets at precisely 2:38 a.m. The first coalition jets crossed into Iraqi airspace through the corridor at approximately 2:45 a.m. 7 minutes. Everything depended on split-second timing, and it worked perfectly. The symbolism of the Apache mission is powerful. These were the first shots of the war. They were fired not by jets or missiles or artillery, but by helicopters, by crews flying low and slow, up close and personal with the enemy. There is something almost medieval about it, the idea of warriors approaching the enemy under cover of darkness, striking suddenly and disappearing. But this was medieval warfare executed with the most advanced technology available. It was a fitting opening to a war that would demonstrate the transformation of warfare through technology. The media coverage of the mission came later. In the first hours of the war, the Apache strike was not publicly known. The media focused on the air attacks on Baghdad, on the cruise missiles, on the stealth fighters. It was only days later that details of the Apache mission emerged. When they did, the mission was hailed as a brilliant success, an example of American military professionalism and technological superiority. The Apache crews became minor celebrities, though most shunned the attention, seeing themselves simply as soldiers doing their jobs. The long-term impact on Apache procurement and deployment was significant. The success of the Apache in the Gulf War led to increased orders. More units were equipped with Apache. The helicopter was exported to allied nations. Improvements and upgrades were funded, leading to the AH-64 Longbow Apache with even more advanced sensors and weapons. The Apache became the backbone of Army aviation, the primary attack helicopter for decades. Its combat debut at the start of the Gulf War established its reputation and justified its existence. The lessons learned from the mission were studied and incorporated into doctrine. The importance of precision navigation, of detailed planning, of rehearsal, of weapon accuracy, all were emphasized in training. The tactics of nap-of-the-earth flying, of using terrain to mask approaches, of standoff engagement with precision weapons, all became standard. The mission became a case study taught at military schools, an example of how to plan and execute a perfect operation. The personal stories of the crews involved are remarkable. These men, most in their late 20s or early 30s, carried the responsibility for starting a war on their shoulders. If they failed, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The air campaign might have been delayed or disrupted. Coalition aircraft might have been shot down in larger numbers. The psychological impact of a failed opening strike would have been significant, but they did not fail. They succeeded brilliantly. Some of these men continued their military careers, rising to senior positions. Others left the service after their obligations were met, returning to civilian life with the knowledge that they had participated in something historic. The fear experienced by the crews before and during the mission was real. One pilot later described the feeling of flying into Iraq, knowing that the entire Iraqi military was below, knowing that if anything went wrong there was no rescue, as the most intense fear he had ever experienced. But he also described how training took over, how he focused on the mission, on the procedures, on doing his job. The fear was there, but it was controlled, channeled into heightened awareness and performance. This is the essence of courage, not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. The camaraderie among the crews was intense. These men trained together for months. They knew each other's lives depended on mutual support and competence. They developed bonds that lasted decades. Years after the war, the crews would gather for reunions, sharing memories, honoring those who did not come home from other missions. The shared experience of that night, of being the first into combat, of executing a perfect mission under the most intense pressure, created relationships that transcended normal friendship. The Apache helicopter itself deserves detailed examination. The AH-64 is a complex machine, the result of decades of development and billions of dollars of investment. It is powered by two turboshaft engines producing over 1,700 horsepower each. The main rotor is 48 feet in diameter. The helicopter weighs about 10,000 pounds empty and can carry another 7,000 pounds of fuel and weapons. It can cruise at 150 miles per hour and has a range of about 300 miles. But speed and range are not what make it special. What makes it special is the integration of sensors, weapons, and avionics into a coherent fighting system. The target acquisition and designation system, mounted in a turret on the front of the helicopter, combines a television camera, an infrared camera, and a laser designator. The pilot and gunner can see what the sensors see on displays in the cockpit. They can zoom in on targets miles away, identify them, and engage them with precision. The infrared camera works in total darkness and can see through smoke and haze, detecting the heat signatures of targets. This capability was revolutionary in 1991 and remains valuable today. The Hellfire missile system is the Apache's primary weapon. Each Apache on the January 17 mission carried 16 Hellfire missiles. The missile is laser-guided, meaning it homes in on a target illuminated by a laser designator. The Apache designates its own targets, though it can also shoot at targets designated by other aircraft or ground units. The Hellfire has a range of up to 8 kilometers and carries a shaped charge warhead designed to penetrate armor. Against the buildings and radar installations at the Iraqi sites, the Hellfires were devastatingly effective. The 17 rocket system provides area suppression. The Apache carries up to 76 rockets in pods mounted on its stub wings. These rockets are unguided but are effective against concentrations of soft targets, vehicles, buildings, personnel. They were used extensively in the January 17 attack to destroy secondary targets and to suppress any resistance. The 30mm230 chain gun is mounted under the helicopter's nose. It fires high explosive rounds at up to 625 rounds per minute. The gun is slaved to the gunner's helmet sight, meaning the gun points wherever the gunner looks. This allows for incredibly fast target engagement. The 30mm gun is effective against light armor, buildings, and personnel. On the mission, it was used to destroy communication equipment, vehicles, and to engage Iraqi personnel trying to fight back. The armor protection on the Apache is significant. The cockpit area is protected by ballistic glass and armor plates that can withstand hits from small arms fire and shell fragments. Critical components like the engines and transmission are armored. The rotor blades are designed to sustain damage and keep functioning. The Apache is designed to take hits and keep flying. This survivability was crucial. If one of the helicopters had been hit by ground fire during the mission, the armor might have allowed it to complete the mission and return home. The night vision systems used by the crews included both aviator night vision goggles, or ANVGs, and the infrared sensors on the TADS. The ANVGs amplify ambient light, allowing the pilots to see in near darkness. They are essential for low-level flight at night, but they have limitations. They do not work in total darkness with no light source. They provide limited depth perception. The infrared sensors complement the ANVGs by detecting heat signatures, which show up clearly even in total darkness. The combination of these systems gave the Apache crews the ability to operate effectively in conditions where Iraqi forces were essentially blind. The GPS navigation system used by the Apache was the NAVSTAR GPS, which had recently become fully operational. The helicopters carried GPS receivers that picked up signals from multiple satellites and calculated the helicopter's position to within a few meters. This allowed precise navigation to specific coordinates even in featureless desert at night. Before GPS, such navigation would have been nearly impossible. Pilots would have relied on dead reckoning, map reading, and landmark navigation, all of which are difficult or impossible in darkness over desert. GPS made the mission feasible. The communication systems on the Apache allowed the crews to coordinate with each other and with command elements. Secure radio communications ensured that the Iraqis could not intercept or jam the radio traffic. The crews maintained radio silence during most of the flight to avoid detection, but once the attack began, they communicated to coordinate fires and to report mission success. The planning tools available to the mission planners included satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and computer modeling. Satellite photos showed the layout of the targets. Signals intelligence confirmed that the radars were operating and provided information about Iraqi communications and activity. Computer simulations allowed planners to model the attack, to test different approaches and tactics, to identify potential problems before the mission ever launched. These tools, which are now standard, were relatively new in 1991 and represented a significant advance in planning capability. The weather on the night of the mission was favorable. Clear skies, good visibility with night vision equipment, light winds. If the weather had been bad, with sandstorms or heavy cloud cover, the mission might have been scrubbed or delayed. Weather is always a factor in military operations. The planners were fortunate that conditions were ideal for the attack. The fuel management for the mission was critical. The Apache had to fly approximately 90 miles to their targets, conduct the attack, and fly 90 miles back. This required careful fuel planning. The helicopters were fully fueled before launch. The pilots monitored fuel consumption throughout the flight, ensuring they had enough to complete the mission and return with adequate reserves. Running out of fuel over enemy territory would have been catastrophic. The fuel systems on the Apache worked flawlessly, and all 8 helicopters returned with fuel to spare. The deconfliction of the airspace, ensuring that the Apache and the jets following behind did not interfere with each other, was managed by the Air Operations Center. The Apache were assigned specific altitudes and routes. The jets were assigned different altitudes and routes. The timing was coordinated so that the Apache would be clear of the area before the jets arrived. This deconfliction is essential in modern warfare, where hundreds of aircraft might be operating in the same airspace. Mistakes can lead to friendly fire incidents or mid-air collisions. The planning prevented these problems. The battle damage assessment after the mission confirmed that both targets were completely destroyed. Satellite imagery taken the next day showed the sites in ruins. No radars were operating. The buildings were demolished. The vehicles were destroyed. The objectives had been achieved. This confirmation was important. It validated the effectiveness of the attack and ensured that the corridor remained open for coalition aircraft. The Iraqi response to the loss of the radar sites was slow and ineffective. By the time Iraqi commanders realized what had happened, The coalition air campaign was in full swing. Hundreds of aircraft were attacking targets across Iraq. The air defense network was being systematically destroyed. The loss of the two early warning sites was just one element of a broader campaign, but it was a critical one. The Iraqis never fully recovered the situational awareness they lost in the first hours of the war. The strategic success of the air campaign owed much to the Apache mission. The element of surprise, the ability to strike targets deep in Iraq before the Iraqis could react, the rapid establishment of air superiority, all flowed from the successful destruction of the radar sites. If those sites had remained operational, if they had detected the incoming jets and provided warning, the air campaign would have been more costly and less effective. The Apache did their job, and the rest of the air campaign benefited. The evolution of the Apache since the Gulf War has been continuous. Newer models incorporate better sensors, more powerful engines, improved weapons, advanced avionics. The AH-64 Guardian, the latest version, is a dramatically more capable aircraft than the AH-64A that flew the January 17 mission. But the fundamental capabilities, the ability to operate at night, to engage targets with precision, to survive in hostile environments, these remain the core of what makes the Apache valuable. The legacy of the January 17 mission lives on in Army aviation. Every Apache crew trains with the knowledge that their predecessors executed one of the most perfect combat missions in history. The standard has been set. The expectation is that Apache crews will operate with the same professionalism, skill, and courage. This legacy is a source of pride and also of pressure. Living up to the example set by the crews who started the Gulf War is a challenge that motivates and inspires. The geopolitical context of the mission is important. The Gulf War was about more than just liberating Kuwait. It was about establishing a new world order after the Cold War, about demonstrating American power and resolve, about protecting oil supplies and regional stability. The success of the Apache mission contributed to these broader goals. It showed that American military power was unmatched. It demonstrated that aggression would be met with overwhelming force. It sent a message to potential adversaries worldwide. The human cost of the war, while relatively low for coalition forces, was significant for Iraqi forces and civilians. The air campaign, which began with the Apache strikes, killed thousands of Iraqis. The destruction of infrastructure caused hardship for civilians. The moral questions about the use of such overwhelming force against a weaker enemy are legitimate and have been debated extensively. But from a purely military perspective, the campaign was executed with a level of professionalism and precision that minimized unnecessary casualties. The Apache crews on January 17 targeted military installations, not civilian areas. They used precision weapons to minimize collateral damage. This was warfare at its most clinical and controlled. The technological superiority demonstrated by the Apache mission and the Gulf War more broadly sparked an arms race. Nations around the world saw what American technology could do and sought to acquire similar capabilities or to develop countermeasures. The proliferation of attack helicopters, precision weapons, night vision systems, and GPS-guided munitions can be traced in part to the lessons of the Gulf War. The world learned that conventional military power had been revolutionized by technology, and every military wanted access to that revolution. The January 17, 1991 Apache mission remains a landmark in military history. It was a perfect execution of a critical mission at the start of a major war. It demonstrated the capabilities of advanced technology operated by highly trained professionals. It opened the door for the most successful air campaign ever conducted. It showed that wars could be started with precision and control rather than with massed artillery barrages or carpet bombing. It was the future of warfare, and that future began in the desert sky over Iraq at 2:38 in the morning when 8 Apache helicopters fired the first shots of Operation Desert Storm.